The sun wasn't even up when I pulled into the Denali National Park Ranger Station parking lot. My breath made little clouds in the cold morning air as I grabbed my backpack from the passenger seat. The station looked almost abandoned this early, just a single light glowing from the main office window. I'd been a ranger here for almost 8 months, but this was my first solo backcountry patrol. The quiet made me more aware of everything. The crunch of gravel under my boots, the weight of my pack, the distant call of birds waking up. Jeremy's truck was already parked in its usual spot. No surprise there. In the short time I'd known him, I'd never once beaten Jeremy Rodriguez to work. The man practically lived at the station. I pushed open the door to find Jeremy hunched over the desk, scribbling something on a piece of paper. He looked up when I walked in, his weathered face serious under the brim of his ranger hat. "Morning," I said, dropping my pack near the door. "Ready for another thrilling day of counting moose droppings?" Jeremy didn't laugh. He just finished writing whatever he was working on and folded the paper carefully. "Miller," he said, nodding at me. "Got a minute?" I headed for the coffee pot. "Sure. Let me just get some caffeine first. Brain doesn't work before sunrise." The coffee was thick and bitter. Typical Jeremy brew that could probably strip paint. I took a big gulp anyway and leaned against the counter. "So what's up?" Jeremy stood and walked over, the folded paper in his hand. "You're heading out to the North Ridge Trail today, right?" "Yeah. Standard patrol. Check the markers, look for any signs of poachers, make sure no hikers got themselves lost. Should be back by tomorrow evening." He held out the paper. "Take this with you." I took it, raising an eyebrow. "What is it? New protocol?" "Something like that." Jeremy scratched his stubbled chin. "It's rules. Survival rules. They're not in any manual, but they'll keep you alive out there." I started to unfold it, curious now. Jeremy had always been serious about safety, but this seemed oddly formal for him. The paper had 5 numbered items written in Jeremy's neat handwriting. 1. If you see a red jacket hanging from a tree, leave it alone. Don't touch it, don't approach it, don't even take a picture of it. Walk away and don't look back. 2. Keep music on your phone. If you find a body with the head missing, put on headphones immediately and play music until you're at least half a mile away. 3. Never talk to anyone with no face. 4. If you hear your name called from the forest, ignore it completely. 5. If you see yourself walking toward you on the trail, run back to the station. Don't stop for anything. I looked up from the paper, waiting for Jeremy to crack a smile. He didn't. "Seriously?" I laughed. "No face? Seeing myself? What is this? Some kind of initiation thing for the new guy? Did Sarah put you up to this?" Jeremy crossed his arms. "This isn't a joke, Miller. These rules have been passed down by rangers who worked this park for decades. The ones who made it back, anyway." "Right." I folded the paper and tucked it in my jacket pocket. "And let me guess, rangers who don't follow the magic rules get eaten by the Denali boogeyman?" "We've lost 6 rangers in 15 years. Never found a trace of them." Jeremy's voice was flat. Every single one was patrolling alone and didn't know the rules. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the morning cold. Jeremy wasn't the type to mess around, but this was ridiculous. "Look, I appreciate the concern, but I've been hiking these mountains since I was a kid. I know how to handle myself in the wilderness. This isn't about wildlife or exposure." Jeremy checked his watch. "We should load up. Sun's coming soon and you've got a long day ahead." I decided to play along. No point arguing with him, and it was probably some elaborate prank the veterans played on newer rangers. I'd been waiting for something like this. Hazing was practically a tradition in places like this. We loaded my gear onto the station ATV in silence. I packed extra water, emergency rations, first aid supplies, and my satellite phone. Standard procedure for backcountry patrol. Jeremy watched me check everything with that same serious expression. "Don't forget a portable charger for your phone," he said. "You might need that music." I rolled my eyes but tossed a charger in my pack anyway. The sky was turning a pale gray as we drove out to the trailhead. Jeremy navigated the bumpy access road with practiced ease, barely slowing for the ruts and potholes I would have crashed into. The ATV's headlight cut through the early morning mist, revealing glimpses of the wilderness around us, tall pines, rocky outcroppings, and the massive mountains looming in the distance. Neither of us talked much during the drive. I was still half asleep despite the coffee, and Jeremy never was much of a talker. The radio crackled occasionally with check-ins from other rangers, but our section of the park was quiet this time of year. Tourist season was winding down, and most hikers stayed on the main trails near the visitor center. We reached the trailhead just as true daylight arrived. I hopped off the ATV and grabbed my gear, ready to get started. The trail ahead disappeared into thick forest, familiar and inviting. I'd hiked parts of it before, but never the full route into the deeper wilderness. Jeremy shut off the engine and looked at me. "Remember those rules, Miller. They matter." "Got it," I said, slinging my pack over my shoulders. "No talking to faceless hikers. I'll be sure to card everyone I meet." "I'm serious." Jeremy's eyes narrowed. "Follow them exactly as written. Don't improvise." I gave him a mock salute. "Yes, sir. I promise not to get eaten by the forest monsters." Jeremy didn't smile. "Radio check-in every 4 hours. If you miss 2 in a row, we'll send someone to find you." "Won't be necessary, but noted." I adjusted my hat against the growing light. "See you tomorrow evening?" Jeremy nodded and started the ATV again. "Be careful out there, Miller." I waved as he turned around and headed back toward the station. As the sound of the engine faded, I was left with the quiet of the forest, the rustling leaves, distant bird calls, and my own breathing. The folded paper sat forgotten in my jacket pocket as I pulled out my trail map. I had markers to check, wildlife to monitor, and miles to cover before nightfall. Whatever game Jeremy was playing would have to wait. I had a job to do. I checked my compass, adjusted my pack one last time, and started down the trail. The morning air was crisp against my face, carrying the smell of pine and earth. Above the trees, the first clear light of day illuminated the snow-capped peaks of Denali. It was going to be a perfect day for a hike. Little did I know that I should have paid much closer attention to that folded piece of paper. 3 hours into my patrol, the hiking rhythm had settled comfortably into my body. The regular pace of my boots on the trail, the weight of my pack against my shoulders, and the clean mountain air filling my lungs had put me in a good mood. The trail wound through dense pine forest, occasionally opening to give breathtaking views of the mountains. I'd already checked 3 trail markers and documented a small herd of caribou grazing in a distant meadow. I rounded a bend in the trail and stopped dead in my tracks. Hanging from a branch that extended over the path was a small red jacket. It swayed gently in the air. No, that wasn't right. It wasn't moving at all, despite the morning breeze that rustled the pine needles around it. The jacket was child-sized, bright red, and looked brand new. The fabric seemed to almost glow against the dark green of the surrounding forest. "What the hell?" I muttered, taking a step closer. My hand froze halfway to my camera as a cold feeling washed over me. Jeremy's rules. The first one specifically mentioned a red jacket hanging from a tree. I pulled the folded paper from my jacket pocket and read it again. 1. If you see a red jacket hanging from a tree, leave it alone. Don't touch it. Don't approach it. Don't even take a picture of it. Walk away, and don't look back. I looked from the paper to the jacket and back again. This had to be part of the prank. Jeremy must have hiked out here early this morning and planted the jacket for me to find. That made more sense than whatever supernatural nonsense he was hinting at. Yet something felt wrong about the whole scene. The jacket hung perfectly still while everything else moved in the breeze. It was also miles from the nearest access point where families with children might hike. Who would abandon a child's jacket this far into the backcountry? I took another step forward, wanting to check for a name tag or any identification. If a child had been lost out here, it was my job to investigate. My radio crackled with static, making me jump. When I looked back at the jacket, it seemed different, somehow. The red color appeared deeper, almost wet-looking in the dappled sunlight. The longer I stared at it, the more wrong it felt. I remembered Jeremy's serious expression this morning. The way he'd said, "Follow them exactly as written. Don't improvise." The rational part of my brain kept insisting this was just a coincidence or a prank, but something deeper, some instinct I couldn't explain, told me to follow the rule. I took a deliberate step backward, then another. The jacket remained perfectly still, hanging in a way that defied the physics of the breeze moving through the trees around it. "Screw this," I said, turning away and continuing down the trail. Each step away from the jacket felt both right and wrong, simultaneously. Part of me wanted to go back and prove there was nothing supernatural about a lost piece of clothing. The other part wanted to put as much distance between myself and that unnaturally still red fabric as possible. I kept hiking, trying to focus on my job. I had miles to cover before setting up camp for the night. The trail markers needed checking, and I had wildlife observations to record. Plenty of work to keep my mind occupied. But the jacket stayed in my thoughts. I found myself glancing back over my shoulder multiple times, half expecting to see something following me. 15 minutes later, I stopped to take a water break at a small clearing. The unease had followed me down the trail, and I couldn't shake it. I turned to look back the way I'd come, squinting through the trees. The jacket was gone. I nearly choked on my water. There was no way anyone could have reached it in that time. I hadn't passed another soul on the trail, and the nearest access point was hours away. No wind could have blown it off the branch, especially not when it had been so unnaturally still. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I capped my water bottle with shaking hands and put it back in my pack. Jeremy's warnings suddenly felt less like a joke and more like a survival guide. What else might I encounter out here? The forest around me seemed quieter now, as if holding its breath. The familiar wilderness I'd been confidently hiking through all morning now felt like strange territory. I pulled out the paper again and read through all 5 rules carefully. No red jackets. Music if you find a headless body. Don't talk to faceless people. Ignore your name if called. Run if you see yourself. This morning I'd laughed at these warnings. Now I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my shirt pocket where I could reach it quickly if needed. I shouldered my pack and continued down the trail, more alert than before. Every sound in the forest caught my attention. The crack of a twig, the call of a bird, the rustle of leaves. I found myself scanning the trees ahead for any splash of red, any movement that didn't belong. The deeper I hiked into the wilderness, the more I wondered what else from Jeremy's list I might encounter before my patrol was over. I kept hiking for another 2 hours, the encounter with the red jacket still fresh in my mind. The forest had changed for me. What started as a routine patrol through familiar territory now felt like walking through a place I'd never truly known. Every shadow between the trees, every unexpected sound made me tense. The trail climbed steadily upward, winding around rocky outcroppings. I checked another trail marker, noting its position on my map and making sure it was properly secured. Focusing on work helped settle my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I spotted the glint of water through the trees to my left, I decided to take a short detour. My canteen needed refilling, and a quick break by a stream might help clear my head. The sound of running water grew louder as I pushed through a thicket of undergrowth, careful not to catch my pack on the branches. The stream cut through a small clearing, water bubbling over smooth stones. It looked normal, inviting even. I took a few steps toward it, already unclipping my canteen from my belt. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards downstream, partially hidden by a fallen log, was what looked like a bundle of clothing. At first, I thought someone had abandoned camping gear, but as I moved closer, my stomach knotted with recognition. A body, a human body, sprawled on its back near the water's edge. My ranger training kicked in. "Hello?" I called out, though it was clear from the unnatural stillness that whoever it was couldn't respond. "Park Service. Are you hurt?" No response. I approached cautiously, scanning for any signs of life while mentally preparing to radio in an emergency. Then I got close enough to see what was wrong. The body had no head. Where the neck ended, there was just nothing. Ragged tissue and exposed vertebrae. The hiking clothes, expensive outdoor gear, were stained dark with what had to be dried blood. Around the corpse, bones were scattered as if animals had been at the remains. A femur lay half buried in mud 10 feet away. What looked like finger bones were spread across the rocky bank. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. This was no fresh accident. The body had been here long enough for wildlife to scatter parts of it, yet the clothes looked relatively intact. Something about the scene was wrong, beyond the obvious horror. Jeremy's rules rushed back to me. Rule 2. Keep music on your phone. If you find a body with the head missing, put on headphones immediately and play music until you're at least half a mile away. My hands trembled so badly I could barely reach into my pocket. I fumbled with my phone, nearly dropping it twice before managing to pull it out. The headphones tangled in my pocket, and I cursed as I tried to untangle them with fingers that felt thick and clumsy. Don't look directly at it, something in my mind whispered. I kept my eyes focused on my phone screen instead of the headless corpse just yards away. I jammed the earbuds into my ears and pulled up my music app, tapping the first playlist I saw. The opening notes of a rock song blasted so loudly it hurt, but I didn't turn it down. I started backing away, keeping my eyes on the ground in front of me. Whatever instinct had made me follow the red jacket rule now screamed at me to get away. This wasn't something I should report or investigate. This was something I needed to flee from. My thoughts raced as I stumbled backward. Who was this person? How long had they been dead? Why hadn't we received reports of a missing hiker? The park kept meticulous records of all backcountry permits, and search teams would have been dispatched for any overdue hikers. Then a more disturbing thought struck me. What if this wasn't a hiker at all? What if this was one of the 6 rangers Jeremy had mentioned, the ones who never came back? I turned and walked faster, no longer bothering to be careful about the undergrowth that scratched at my face and arms. I needed to get back to the trail. The music pounded in my ears, drowning out most forest sounds, but not my own heartbeat or ragged breathing. Something felt wrong about the body beyond the obvious horror of finding human remains. It seemed deliberately placed, like a display set up for someone to find. For me to find. The position was too neat, the clothing too intact for how long it must have been there. I resisted the overwhelming urge to look back. The music couldn't completely mask the sense that something was happening behind me. Movement, something following in my wake. The trail appeared ahead through the trees, and I picked up my pace to a jog. Back on the marked path, I headed downhill, toward the direction of the ranger station, no longer caring about completing my patrol route. Every landmark I passed, a distinctive bent tree, a boulder shaped like a turtle, a wooden footbridge over a dry creek bed, looked sinister now. Places I'd hiked past just hours ago with confidence now seemed threatening, as if the forest itself had transformed while I wasn't looking. I checked over my shoulder as I jogged, seeing nothing but trees and shadows, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, only intensified. Even with music blaring in my ears, I could swear I heard something moving through the forest parallel to the trail, keeping pace with me. My mind kept returning to the headless body, to the red jacket, to Jeremy's face as he handed me that paper with the rules. Rules I'd laughed at this morning. I wasn't laughing now. The forest I thought I knew so well suddenly felt like alien territory. I'd grown up hiking these mountains, spent months working these trails as a ranger, and yet now I felt like a stranger in a place I'd never seen before. I kept moving, one foot in front of the other, the music in my ears my only comfort as I made my way back through a wilderness that no longer felt like home. 20 minutes later, I was still moving at a brisk pace along the trail, the music pounding in my ears. Every few seconds, I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me. The image of that headless body by the stream was burned into my mind. The ragged neck, the scattered bones, the neatly arranged clothing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd disturbed something by finding it. The trail narrowed as it cut through a dense section of pines. Overhead, the branches formed a canopy that blocked much of the daylight, creating a twilight effect even though it was still early afternoon. My boots crunched on pine needles as I maintained my quick walking pace, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and that grisly scene. I turned down the volume of my music slightly, just enough to hear if anything approached. Jeremy's rules kept cycling through my head. I'd already encountered 2 of the 5 warnings in less than a day. What were the odds? This couldn't be coincidence anymore. The trail curved ahead, winding around a massive boulder that blocked my view of what lay beyond. As I rounded the bend, I spotted a figure walking toward me about 50 yards away. Relief washed over me. Another human being. Maybe another ranger or a hiker with a backcountry permit. After what I'd experienced, seeing someone normal would be welcome. I raised my hand in greeting as we drew closer. The person wore standard hiking gear, khaki pants, a blue moisture-wicking shirt, and a small day pack. Their movements seemed perfectly natural as they navigated the uneven terrain of the trail, but something felt off. The closer they got, the more my relief transformed into unease. They weren't acknowledging my greeting. Their head was angled slightly downward, making it hard to see their face under the brim of their hat. When we were about 20 feet apart, the hiker finally looked up. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. Where there should have been eyes, a nose, a mouth, there was nothing. Just smooth, pale skin stretched tightly over the skull. No features at all. Not even indentations where features should be. Just blank, flesh-colored emptiness. My mind reeled, trying to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. People don't just walk around without faces. Maybe it was a mask, a prank. The faceless figure tilted its head slightly, as if curious about my reaction. Then it took another step toward me. Jeremy's rules slammed back into my consciousness. Never talk to anyone without a face. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the dirt trail as I sprinted away from the faceless hiker. The music still played in my ears, but I barely registered it over the sound of my own ragged breathing. I pushed my body harder, faster, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever that thing was. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Not the measured pace of a normal hiker, but rapid, unnatural footfalls gaining speed. The thing was chasing me. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The faceless figure was running, if you could call it that. Its movements were all wrong, its limbs bending at angles that human joints shouldn't allow. And it was fast, much faster than any person should be able to move through dense forest terrain. The gap between us was closing. I faced forward again and ran harder, my lungs burning with the effort. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I veered off the main trail, hoping to lose my pursuer in the thicker undergrowth. My pack bounced painfully against my back, but I didn't dare stop to adjust it. The sound of pursuit grew louder behind me. Over the music in my headphones, I could hear something else, a wet, rasping noise that could only be the thing's breathing. The sound made my skin crawl, raising goosebumps along my arms despite the sweat pouring down my face. I crashed through a thicket, thorns tearing at my uniform and scratching my hands. The main trail appeared again ahead of me, and I lunged for it, knowing I'd make better time on the clear path. I had to get back to the station. That was the only thought in my mind now. Reach the station, get inside, find help. My foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard, sprawling across the dirt. Pain shot through my knee and palms as they scraped against the ground. One of my earbuds popped out, and suddenly the forest sounds were deafening. Birds calling, wind in the trees, and worst of all, those unnatural footsteps drawing closer. I scrambled to my feet, jamming the earbud back in place, and took off again. My knee throbbed with each step, but fear pushed me forward. Through a break in the trees, I spotted the gray roof of the ranger station. It was still at least a quarter-mile away, but the sight gave me a surge of desperate energy. I pushed myself harder, legs pumping as I flew down the trail. The breathing sound behind me grew louder, closer. I could almost feel it on the back of my neck now. The station's wooden walls came into view, then the front steps, the door. 50 yards. 30. 20. With one final burst of speed, I reached the small clearing in front of the station and sprinted across it. My hand found the door handle and I yanked it open, throwing myself inside before slamming it shut behind me. I collapsed against the door, gasping for breath, legs trembling so badly I could barely stand. My chest heaved as I tried to pull air into my burning lungs. Through my panting and the music still playing in my ears, I became aware that I wasn't alone. Jeremy and Sarah Thompson sat at their desks on the far side of the room, both wearing headphones. They looked up at my dramatic entrance, but their expressions weren't what I expected. No shock, no concern, just calm recognition. Something slammed into the door behind me, the impact so violent it nearly knocked me forward. The entire wall shook. I yelped and stumbled away from the door, backing toward the center of the room. Another impact hit the door, then another. The windows rattled in their frames with each blow. Whatever was outside wanted in, and from the force of the pounding it might actually break through. I opened my mouth to shout, to ask what the hell was happening, but Jeremy held up his hand in a clear signal to be quiet. Then he pointed to a pair of over-ear headphones sitting on the counter. I looked from Jeremy to Sarah, bewildered. Sarah hadn't even gotten up from her desk. She was typing something on her computer as if nothing unusual was happening, despite the fact that the entire building shook with each impact against the door. Another thunderous blow hit the station wall, and I lunged for the headphones. Whatever was happening, Jeremy clearly knew the protocol. I slipped them over my ears, disconnecting my earbuds from my phone and plugging in the larger headphones instead. The pounding continued, each impact sending vibrations through the floor beneath my feet. I could feel it in my bones, even if the headphones muffled the actual sound. The door looked sturdy, but how long would it hold against that kind of force? Jeremy motioned for me to sit down. His face was serious but calm, as if this were a routine occurrence. He pointed to his own headphones, then gave me a thumbs up, asking if mine were working. I nodded, though I still had no idea what was happening. Sarah slid a notepad across her desk toward me. On it she had written, "Don't speak. It can mimic voices. Music only until it leaves." I stared at the note, then back at the door as it shuddered under another powerful blow. The thing outside, the faceless hiker, could mimic voices. What else could it do? How long would it stay out there? I sank into a chair, legs still weak from my desperate run. My uniform was torn in several places and blood seeped from scratches on my hands and face. My knee throbbed where I'd fallen. Jeremy and Sarah returned to their work as if this were all perfectly normal. Sarah continued typing at her computer while Jeremy sorted through a stack of papers, occasionally making notes, all while something that shouldn't exist tried to break down our door. I turned up the volume on my music, trying to drown out the vibrations I could feel through the floor. The pounding continued, relentless and methodical, as if the thing outside had all the time in the world. I thought of the rules Jeremy had given me, the ones I'd laughed at just this morning. The red jacket, the headless body, now a faceless person. 3 out of 5 rules encountered in a single day. What were the odds? I pulled the folded paper from my pocket and read through the rules again, my hands still shaking. Rule 3. Never talk to anyone without a face. I'd followed it instinctively, running without saying a word. Had that saved my life? The building shook with another powerful impact. I looked at Jeremy and Sarah, calmly working at their desks while something impossible tried to break in. How many times had they been through this before? How much was there about this park that I didn't know? I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let the music wash over me. The pounding continued outside, each impact a reminder that the wilderness I thought I knew was home to things I'd never imagined, things that apparently wanted in. The pounding on the door continued with methodical precision. Each impact sent vibrations through the wooden floor beneath my feet, traveling up through my chair and into my bones. I checked my watch. 20 minutes had passed since I'd burst into the station. 20 minutes of that thing outside trying to get in. I kept the headphones tight over my ears, music playing at a volume that bordered on painful. The large over-ear cups blocked most external sound, but I could still feel each blow against the building. My knee throbbed where I'd fallen on the trail, and small trails of blood had dried on my scratched hands. Jeremy sat at his desk, calmly reviewing paperwork as though nothing unusual was happening. Across the room, Sarah continued typing at her computer, occasionally glancing at the door when a particularly strong impact made the windows rattle. Their composure was almost as unsettling as what waited outside. I pulled out my phone, ready to call for backup or emergency services. This wasn't something we could handle alone. Whatever was out there was strong enough to shake the entire building. I started to dial, but Jeremy noticed and held up his hand, making a sharp cutting motion across his throat. I pointed at my phone, mouthing the words, "Call for help," even though I knew he couldn't hear me through his headphones. Jeremy shook his head firmly. He pulled a notepad toward him, wrote something quickly, and slid it across to me. It mimics voices perfectly, has tricked rescue teams before. Stay quiet. I stared at the note, my finger hovering over the call button. The building shook with another powerful blow. What if the door gave way? What if the windows broke? Shouldn't we at least try to get help? Sarah must have read my expression. She got up from her desk and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner. After rifling through a drawer, she pulled out a folder and brought it to me. She opened it on the desk in front of me, tapping her finger on the first page. It was an incident report dated 5 years earlier. The heading read, "Search and Rescue Operation, Ranger Mitchell Davis." I skimmed the contents while the pounding continued outside. The report detailed how Ranger Davis had radioed for help, claiming to be injured on the North Ridge Trail. A rescue team was dispatched but found no sign of Davis at the coordinates he provided. Instead, they discovered his radio abandoned on a rock, still operational, with no tracks or evidence of his presence. Sarah flipped to the next report. This one described a ranger who had gone missing 3 years ago. The search team reported hearing his voice calling for help from deep in the forest, but the voice seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. 2 members of the search party were later found unconscious with no memory of what had happened. The missing ranger was never located. Report after report documented similar incidents. Rangers who disappeared. Search parties that heard familiar voices calling from impossible locations. Radio communications that made no sense or contained sounds that couldn't be explained. I pushed the folder away, my stomach turning. The station shook with another impact. I looked at Jeremy, who watched me with a grim expression. He knew I was starting to understand. 30 minutes became 45. The pounding never slowed or faltered. Whatever was outside had inhuman patience and stamina. I checked my watch again. Almost an hour had passed since I'd first burst through the door. My music playlist had cycled through completely and started over. I studied Jeremy and Sarah, trying to understand how they could remain so calm. This clearly wasn't their first encounter with the thing outside. How many times had they sat here, listening to music while something tried to break down their door? How many times had they watched new rangers like me come face to face with the impossible? The folder of incident reports sat on the desk in front of me. I pulled it back and continued reading, desperate for any information that might help make sense of what was happening. Some reports were incomplete. Others contained redacted sections. A few included photographs of evidence, strange markings on trees, unidentifiable tracks in mud, torn clothing with no blood. One report caught my eye. It detailed the recovery of a ranger's notebook found beside a partial set of remains. The notebook contained what appeared to be hastily written guidelines for surviving encounters with anomalous entities in the park's backcountry. Several of these guidelines matched the rules Jeremy had given me that morning. I looked up at Jeremy, who nodded slowly. The rules hadn't been made up. They were real, written in blood by those who'd learned the hard way what happened when you encountered the impossible. After an hour and 10 minutes, the pounding suddenly stopped. The silence was so abrupt it felt like a physical presence. I tensed, waiting for something worse. Maybe it had found another way in. Maybe it was circling the building, looking for weak points. Jeremy held up a hand, signaling patience. He tapped his watch, then held up 3 fingers, followed by a 0. 30 minutes. We needed to wait 30 minutes before we could be sure it was gone. Those 30 minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. Every creak of the building settling, every rustle of branches against the windows made me flinch. I kept expecting the pounding to resume, for windows to shatter, for that faceless thing to find its way inside. Finally, Jeremy checked his watch and removed his headphones. He looked around the room, listening carefully, then nodded to Sarah and me. I pulled off my headphones, wincing at the sudden absence of music. The normal sounds of the forest filtered in through the windows, birds calling, wind in the trees, the distant rush of water. No pounding, no unnatural breathing, no faceless hiker trying to break down our door. "Is it gone?" I asked, my voice sounding strange after hours of silence. Jeremy nodded. "For now." Sarah stood and stretched, rolling her shoulders. They never stay more than 2 hours. Don't know why. Just one of the patterns we've noticed. I rubbed my face with my hands, trying to process everything. "What was that thing? How many of them are out there?" "We don't know what they are," Jeremy said, his voice low and serious. "Nobody does. We just know they exist, and they're dangerous." "But the rules," I started. "The rules keep you alive," Jeremy finished for me. He walked to the window and looked out at the forest beyond. "They've been developed over decades by rangers who survived encounters with things that shouldn't exist in these woods." Sarah closed the folder of incident reports. Some rules came from rangers who barely escaped with their lives. Others, she hesitated. Others came from notes found with bodies that were eventually recovered. "Like the notebook mentioned in that report?" I asked. She nodded. "Ranger Michaels. We found what was left of him 6 years ago. His notebook had detailed descriptions of encounters with what he called duplicates, things that looked like people but weren't. Rule 5 came from his notes." I remembered Rule 5. Run back to the station without stopping if you see yourself walking toward you on the trail. "The music," I said, pointing to the headphones. "Why does that work?" Jeremy turned from the window. "We don't know why it works, just that it does. Ranger Chen discovered it by accident 4 years ago when she encountered a headless body while listening to music on patrol. She reported it later, not knowing it was significant. 3 more rangers encountered similar bodies. The 2 who were listening to music survived. The one who wasn't didn't come back. I thought of the headless corpse by the stream, the scattered bones, the ragged neck. Was that one of our missing rangers I found today?" Sarah and Jeremy exchanged glances. "Possibly," Sarah said. "We've never recovered all our missing personnel. Some just vanish." "But why haven't I heard about any of this?" I asked. "I've been working here for 8 months. Why keep new rangers in the dark until they're already out in the field?" Jeremy sighed and sat on the edge of his desk. "Would you have believed me if I'd told you all this during your orientation? That there are things in these woods that defy explanation? Things that can look like people, sound like people, but aren't people at all?" I remembered how I'd laughed at the rules this morning, how I'd assumed it was all an elaborate prank. No, I wouldn't have believed him. "The Park Service higher-ups don't acknowledge any of this officially," Sarah added. "These incident reports, they're kept separate from the official records. As far as administration is concerned, rangers who disappear are victims of typical wilderness hazards, falls, exposure, wildlife attacks. But the ones who come back," Jeremy said, "they learn. And they pass on what they learn to others. That's how the rules get refined, updated. That's how we survive." I looked at the paper with the 5 rules, now wrinkled from being folded and unfolded so many times today. "So all of these are real? The red jacket, the headless bodies, the faceless people, the voices calling your name, seeing yourself on the trail. They've all happened before?" "Many times," Jeremy confirmed, "though not usually 3 in one day like you experienced. That's unusual." I thought about how close I'd come to touching that red jacket, to investigating the headless body as a potential crime scene, to speaking to the faceless hiker. Any one of those decisions could have been fatal. "From now on," I said, tucking the paper carefully into my shirt pocket, "these rules stay with me on every patrol." Jeremy nodded, something like approval in his expression. "Follow them exactly as written. Don't improvise." I understand now, and I did. The rules weren't superstition or ranger folklore. They were documented survival strategies for dealing with genuinely dangerous phenomena that inhabited the remote areas of the park. My life depended on respecting the strange realities of this wilderness. Sarah returned to her computer. "You should get those scratches cleaned up. First aid kit's in the bathroom." I stood, suddenly aware again of my various injuries from the desperate flight through the forest. As I walked toward the bathroom, I realized that the park I thought I knew had been transformed forever. The familiar trails, the peaceful forests, the mountain views I'd grown up with, they were still there, still beautiful. But now I knew they hid impossible dangers that most people would never see or understand. I pulled out the rules one more time and read them carefully, committing each word to memory. My life might depend on it.